There are barricades all over the streets of Sudan. The economy has been brought to a virtual halt as airport workers, lecturers, the doctors' union, and even the state oil company Sudapet have gone on strike. Thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of more workers have refused to show up at work. At the time of this video, at least 7 have been killed and hundreds have been brutally injured. The internet is cut in Sudan. Only intermittently do we even have access to our comrades and relatives on the ground. All of this has of course been in response to a coup that happened on Sunday, October the 24th, 2021, which occurred shy of only a month before the military was supposed to hand over power to a civilian-held government. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Hemmeti, war criminals that are likely responsible for a massacre on June 3, 2019, declared a state of emergency. They dissolved the ruling cabinet, arrested the prime ministers, his wife, and senior members of his cabinet. In Sudan, now there is an attempt to establish a military dictatorship. The people of Sudanese descent, declaring regression is not possible, will not stop fighting until they achieve a fully civilian-led democratic state. Now, how did it get to this? A failed civilian military experiment and an unsurprising outcome, a coup. Okay, so now we're going to have to go back and provide some context for the revolution. What follows is in fact a word-for-word recount of an article I wrote for the Global African Worker back in August 2019. The link is in the description, so go and check that out. Now, you may have missed it. Millions joined general strike, a headline not often imagined in a contemporary world where the power of the working class is often consigned, even by some leftists, to the 20th century. But this was how The Guardian accurately described what Sudanese workers were doing to bring a military council to heel. And you may have missed it precisely because this industrial action came largely in response to a massacre that overshadowed it days before, on June 3rd, when a sit-in was horrifically dispersed. Women were raped, hundreds were killed, and dozens were thrown alive into the River Nile. The people of Sudan collectively felt traumatized by this onslaught. But while the world sympathized with Sudan and a growing Blue for Sudan campaign was propagated by dozens of celebrities who raised their support, there wasn't much commentary on how Sudanese people resisted that state of affairs. And their weapon of action was the general strike, and the protagonist was the Sudanese worker. A general strike involving millions in the midst of a revolution should have sparked the imagination of millions more across the world. The Sudanese people by then had already overthrown a dictator that was in power for 30 years and had even developed a sophisticated resistance to get rid of the deep state which survived him. That sympathy trumped solidarity instead is the biggest tragedy of all. Now, the revolution in Sudan began in December 2018 in the town of Damazin before spreading across the country. It was in response to the frustrations and trauma of living under a brutal 30-year dictatorship that operated ghost houses, where dissidents would be tortured and disappeared, a regime which caused a genocide in Darfur and led to the secession of South Sudan. So the Sudanese regime brought millions to the brink of starvation. The most immediate problem was also close to the stomach, the cost of bread. Under recommendations by the International Monetary Fund, the Sudanese government in 2018 cut subsidies on fuel and bread, which led to massive inflation and food and cash shortages. Unable to recover from the secession of the South, which took its oil export economy with it, the Sudanese government continued to only further impose austerity measures, which made day-to-day life miserable for the common Sudanese person. People were fed up. In city after city, the Sudanese people rose up, and the state security apparatus, funded by 88% of the country's GDP, could not keep up. By the time the uprising hit the capital city of Khartoum, the underground Sudanese Professionals Association, an alliance of band unions, came to the fore and quickly became the vanguard of the struggle. The SPA drafted the Declaration of Freedom and Change and lent its newfound legitimacy to traditional opposition parties. On January 1st, Forces for Freedom and Change coalesced into an official body. From then on, months would pass by with street protests occurring every day. The regime did everything, with each concession after concession receiving the resounding response of just fall that is all. Even a state of emergency and thousands of arbitrary arrests could not stop the rebellion. A turning point in the revolution was when the Forces for Freedom and Change and the Sudanese Professionals Association called for a sit-in outside the military headquarters on April 6th, a date that was supposed to coincide with Sudan's 1985 revolution that led to the end of the Nimeri regime. By April 11th, with millions occupying the headquarters of the military bases in the regions, Umar al-Bashir, a dictator of 30 years, was overthrown. On the following day, Ibn Auf, the man whom the former regime decided would stand in power, was overthrown as well. Bashir was succeeded by the Transitional Military Council led by General Burhan to represent the military and Himeti to represent the Rapid Support Forces. Now, the Rapid Support Forces are a militia that grew out of Bashir's mercenaries who committed the Darfur genocide. But seeing that the tide had turned against Bashir, they turned on him in the last moment. So from that point on, the political battlefield was redrawn. The Forces for Freedom and Change was supposed to represent the ideals of the masses, although often, unfortunately, they also represented the desires of its party members. And the Transitional Military Council represented the political machinery that outlived Bashir's rule. The former, the Forces for Freedom and Change, called for civilian rule, and the latter called for military rule. Both tragically felt that some compromise in between was inevitable, even if the streets often felt otherwise.
We toppled al-Bashir and we toppled Ibn Auf in less than 24 hours. And I think if we kept our movement going, we can also pressure the military to handle powers to civilians.
And if they don't buckle to pressure, you will topple them too?
Yeah, that's what we are going to do.
Throughout the negotiation process, the Forces for Freedom and Change relied on 4 strategies in order to have leverage over the Transitional Military Council: street protests, sit-ins outside various regional headquarters of the military across the country, general strikes, and crafty domestic and international meetings behind closed doors. Until an agreement could be made, those of us who attended the sit-in remained firmly entrenched with the dream of a fully run civilian democratic state. That was, of course, until the sit-in that was viciously dispersed on June 3, 2019. At 5:30 a.m., those in attendance of the sit-in began to broadcast what could be nothing short of pandemonium. Thousands of militiamen, armed with weapons provided to them by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, descended upon the sit-in with the desire for blood. The Rapid Support Forces had been ordered not only to disperse the sit-in, but to do so in the most sadistic of ways. Tents were burnt, women were kidnapped, hundreds were killed, and dozens were thrown into the Nile. By the time the details began to be uncovered, even the TMC was panic-stricken, and an immediate internet blackout, just like the one that's going on now, had to be declared.
Shops have been closed and streets are empty across Sudan's capital, Khartoum, on the first day of a general strike in Sudan.
It's one person's been killed in mass protests taking place across Sudan. Thousands of people are demanding the military hand power to civilians. We can get the very latest now from...
Traumatized, the revolutionaries of Sudan still valiantly persisted towards their goal. General strikes and a march that brought millions to the street brought the TMC to heel. In July, an agreement had come into fruition. A 3-year transition period under the joint control of the Sovereign Council with 6 civilians and 5 military members. It was a flawed agreement, one which I personally strongly opposed, but one which millions in Sudan celebrated as a partial win. Now, before proceeding to explain why, however imperfectly, the streets won, we must ask why the tragedy of June 3rd occurred. Street protests occurred daily, but Bashir was still able to hold power for months before abdicating. The sit-in brought Bashir's downfall largely because lower-ranked soldiers joined the revolutionaries in the sit-in to fight back against the militias of Bashir and his ardent loyalist, Ali Osman Muhammad Taha. With fissures in the armed forces and various armed bodies aligned with the state fighting against each other, and with geopolitical pressure by UAE and Saudi Arabia, a cosmetic regime change was brought into being, one that the Sudanese people didn't fall for after they promised to remain firmly entrenched in their sit-ins until the transition to democracy could be secured. This was not going to be an Egypt 2.0. The people seemed to have the upper hand. So why did the massacre happen suddenly? The fulcrum was likely the industrial action. the strikes that brought the economy to a halt a week prior to the emptying of the sit-in. On May 28th, a two-day national strike brought the economy to a standstill. In Khartoum airport, pilots refused to fly, and the airspace was shut down after multiple airlines cancelled their flights. The roads were empty because buses refused to move. In the Blue Nile state, various ministries, including the Ministry of Culture and Social Welfare, closed office. In El Jazeera and Sinnar, the electricity company and water authority went on strike. In Port Sudan, workers broke operations and only Hajj pilgrims to Mecca could embark from the Red Sea port of Suakin. But what truly angered the Rapid Support Forces was the closure of the central bank. Outside of Khartoum Central Bank, workers within the bank joined hands with their counterparts in the oil ministry. Dozens of RSF trucks descended on the scene and tried to force the workers to return to work at gunpoint. This was no surprise, for Mohammed Hamdan Hemeti had made the position of the RSF clear a week prior. The general strike was a red line. By sunset of the 29th, on a night in Ramadan, Hemeti sat with fasting RSF soldiers to make clear the official position of the Transitional Military Council. "We have been deceived by the slogans of the FFC," he told them. "Now they have confirmed the truth of their intentions. By Eid it would be decided. The massacre would begin and the country would be terrorized into submission for daring to bring the economy to a halt." Thankfully, this is not how the story ends. Certainly, it took less than a week for the next industrial action to take place. For the 3 days of Eid, Sudanese families were too afraid to leave their homes. Gunshots by the RSF could be heard even in the most affluent of neighborhoods. It was probably the first year in the history of Sudan when families could not do their annual visits to friends and kin. But the FFC had proposed an ingenious plan. On the days of the general strike, one went to work and refused to engage. But if they were to be terrorized in their homes, then after Eid, they would engage in massive civil disobedience by staying in them. The RSF could force bankers to go to work, but even with its 50,000 strong force, it couldn't force people to leave their homes. By June 9th, millions reported across the country that they had refused to go to work, including, crucially, the vast majority of Sudanese workers, peasants, and informal workers. Slowly afterward, gaining confidence and taking advantage of even the TMC's shame, which refused to admit ordering the attack, until far later, the people took to the streets. The slogans were darker. It was heartbreaking. Either you or the nation, prepare your coffin, send ambulance after ambulance. These were the slogans, and they had seen the worst, and they let the TMC know that they were prepared for the worst. It was a surprise that they still had the ideological commitment to non-violence, even after such a vicious, brutal attack. By June 30th, the Forces for Freedom and Change had gained enough confidence to call for a Millions March. This time, it would coincide with the 30th anniversary of the 1989 coup that brought Bashir to power. People were angry, and sure enough, 1 million took to the street. It had been the biggest street protest, most likely in the history of Sudan, and it happened all across the country. At least 10 protesters were killed on that day. Declan Walsh of the New York Times has also written about a secret meeting that coincided with the Millions March. On one side, the furious Forces for Freedom and Change, still enraged by the massacre, and on the other, Hemeti. On the table also was the US envoy to Sudan, Donald Booth, and officials from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who had seemed to be turning against the TMC after the catastrophic emptying of June 3rd, even embarrassed them. And they, believe me, are shameless. By this time, the general strike had been called off. The US envoy had been sent to, open quote, defuse the situation, and it's not hard to imagine why. Industrial action is terrifying enough, but a Millions March could be Sudan's storming of the Winter Palace. What the mainstream media often describes as US support for civilian rule in Sudan is in fact the opposite. They are not the motor of democracy. In Sudan, in fact, they pulled the emergency brake. By July, the agreement had been set. The military and civilians had now commenced the transition.